Conference room on the 42nd floor of Hartwell Capital smelled like leather and old money. The kind of money that doesn't apologize for existing. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a Chicago skyline like a painting someone had hung there specifically to remind you how small you were. I stood near the back wall with a glass of water I hadn't touched, watching my father adjust his cufflinks at the head of the table. He was in his element. He always was when he was about to take something from me. There were 32 people in that room. Board members, partners, attorneys. My brother's new father-in-law, a man who smelled like cigar smoke and entitlement. And my brother himself, Theo, standing beside my father with the practiced ease of someone who had been told his whole life that rooms like this belonged to him. They did not yet know that the room, in a very specific and legally binding sense, belonged to me. My father tapped the microphone. The low murmur of conversation died. He smiled the way he always smiled at moments like this, wide and warm and completely hollow. He said he had spent 40 years building Hartwell Capital from a two-person operation in a rented office in Wicker Park into one of the most respected mid-market private equity firms in the Midwest. He said that legacy wasn't just about money, it was about family. It was about passing the torch to the right hands at the right time. Then he turned to my brother and said those hands were Theo's. The applause started before he even finished the sentence. My father announced that effective the first of the month, Theodore Hartwell would assume the role of managing director and majority stakeholder of Hartwell Capital, with full operational authority over the firm's portfolio, hiring decisions, and strategic direction. He said the board had voted unanimously. He said this was the future of the Hartwell name. He never looked at me once. Before I tell you what happened when the applause stopped, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I want to know how far this reaches. I didn't clap. I didn't cry. I didn't do the thing I had done at 19, at 22, at 26, which was to find the nearest bathroom, lock the door, and let myself fall apart quietly so no one could hold it against me. I stood with my back straight and my face neutral, and I watched my father hand my brother the company I had spent 8 years making worth something, like it was a birthday gift he'd picked up on the way. My name is Lena. I'm 31 years old, and until approximately 14 months ago, I was the head of portfolio strategy at Hartwell Capital. I was also, though my father didn't know it yet, the single largest individual shareholder of the firm's holding company, not through inheritance, not through nepotism, but through 4 years of legally purchasing secondary shares from departing partners at below-market rates, while my father was busy underestimating me. I don't say this to brag. I say it because you need to understand what kind of woman stands in the back of a room while her father publicly erases her and does not move. The kind who has already moved. The kind who moved quietly, methodically, over years, while everyone else was busy not taking her seriously. I should explain how we got here. My father started Hartwell Capital with my mother's inheritance and his own ambition, in that order, though he rarely mentioned the first part in speeches. My mother died when I was 11. Theo was 8. My father grieved the way powerful men sometimes grieve, by working harder, loving less, and deciding that whatever softness remained in him would be poured exclusively into his son. I understood it. I even forgave it, for a long time. What I couldn't forgive was the way he systematically mistook his grief for good judgment. I graduated top of my class from Northwestern with a double major in finance and economics. I turned down an offer from Goldman Sachs because my father asked me to come home to help build something that would last. I believed him. I spent 8 years restructuring underperforming portfolio companies, identifying acquisition targets, and building the analytical infrastructure that took Hartwell from a $200 million AUM firm to just over $1.1 billion. I did not do this alone, but I did more of it than anyone in that room would have admitted that afternoon. My brother Theo, for reference, had spent those same 8 years getting an MBA he barely used, managing a small regional fund that lost money for 3 consecutive years, and marrying into the Calloway family, whose patriarch, a man named Douglas, had enough political connections to make my father believe that the Calloway name was worth more to the firm's future than my track record. 6 months before that board meeting, my father called me into his office and told me he was restructuring my role. He said the firm needed new energy at the top. He said I would always be part of the Hartwell family. He said he hoped I could support my brother's transition. I asked him, very calmly, whether the decision had anything to do with the fact that Theo's new father-in-law had offered to bring $300 million in committed capital to the firm if Theo held the managing director title. My father told me I was being paranoid. I was not being paranoid. I was being a forensic reader of the situation, which is what 8 years in private equity had made me. I knew exactly what was happening. My father was trading my work for Douglas Calloway's money, and he was doing it without a second thought because he had never, not once in 31 years, truly believed I was the one holding the ceiling up. I walked out of his office that afternoon and made 2 phone calls. The first was to my attorney. The second was to the one remaining senior partner at Hartwell who had watched what I built and knew exactly who had built it. What I did next took 4 months, 3 separate legal strategies, and a level of patience I didn't know I had. But I had been watching my father operate for 31 years. I knew how he moved. I knew what he paid attention to and, more importantly, what he didn't. He did not pay attention to secondary share transactions below a certain threshold. He did not pay attention to the quiet exit packages of 2 senior partners who had decided after some very thoughtful conversations with me that they were ready to retire. He did not pay attention to the shareholder agreement clause, drafted 8 years ago by an attorney who has since retired, which stipulated that any change in majority control required approval from shareholders representing at least 60% of the firm's equity. He had never bothered to check what percentage I held. I stood in that conference room and watched Theo shake hands with Douglas Calloway while the board applauded, and I counted. Theo's newly issued shares, 22%. My father's retained position, 18%. Douglas Calloway's committed capital gave him observer status but no voting equity. The remaining board members held fractional positions totaling just under 40% combined. I held 23.4%. No transaction, no restructuring, no change of control was valid without my signature. My father found me by the window during the reception that followed. He had a glass of scotch and the look he always got when he wanted something from me. Not warm exactly, but warmer than usual. Manage warmth. The kind you deploy when you need compliance. He said he hoped I was proud of what we'd built together. I said I was. He said he knew this was difficult, but that family was bigger than any one role. I said I agreed. He said Theo was going to need my support during the transition. He said I was the smartest person in the room and he needed me to use that to help my brother succeed. That last part was the one that cracked something open in me, just slightly. Not because it was cruel, because it was true, and he had spent 31 years knowing it was true and choosing to use it as a resource rather than acknowledge it as an achievement. You're the smartest person in the room, Lena, so be useful. Don't be inconvenient. I had heard that my entire life in 100 different phrasings. I had a full scholarship and he asked me to use it for the firm. I had a competing job offer and he called it a betrayal of the family. I had 8 years of documented performance and he handed the keys to my brother because my brother had married someone with the right last name. I looked at my father and I thought about the version of me that would have nodded, that would have smiled instead of course and gone home and spent the weekend pretending she was fine. I had been that version for a long time. She was exhausted. She was done. I understand, I said. I really do. And I want this transition to go smoothly. But there's something we need to go over before anything moves forward. He tilted his head. Something in my tone registered. He was a careful man. He had not built a $1.1 billion firm by ignoring tonal shifts. What kind of something? The kind that requires the full board, I said, and probably your attorney. I watched him recalibrate. I watched him search my face for the tell that would confirm I was bluffing. He didn't find it because I wasn't. He called a 15-minute break in the reception. He pulled the firm's general counsel, a man named Martin, into the side conference room along with Theo, Douglas Calloway, and 2 board members. I walked in last and set a 12-page document on the table. It was a shareholder notice of objection to the proposed change of control. citing the 60% approval threshold in the original partnership agreement, accompanied by a certified accounting of my current equity position. Martin picked it up. His expression, which had been professionally neutral, shifted in a way that was very difficult to interpret unless you were watching closely. I was watching closely. He looked at my father. He looked at the document. He said, very quietly, that he needed a moment to review this. My father looked at me the way he had looked at me exactly once before, when I was 14 and I caught him in an inconsistency in the estate documents for my mother's inheritance and pointed it out in front of his attorney. It was not a warm look. It was the look of a man recalculating what he was dealing with. Theo said, "What is this?" "It's a shareholder notice," I said. "Standard procedure when a proposed transaction may not meet the approval threshold outlined in the partnership agreement." He looked at my father. "Dad, what is she talking about?" My father said nothing. He was reading over Martin's shoulder. Douglas Calloway, to his credit, had gone very still. He was the kind of man who had been in enough rooms to recognize when the floor plan had changed. He wasn't panicking. He was watching. Martin set the document down. He said that based on a preliminary review, the equity position outlined was consistent with share transfer records on file. He said that if accurate, the proposed change of control structure did not meet the 60% threshold required under Section 7.3 of the original partnership agreement. He said the transaction as structured could not proceed. The room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with respect. My brother said my name, just my name, flat, like he was testing whether sound still worked. I said yes. He said, "You can't do this." I said, "I'm not doing anything. I'm following the partnership agreement. The same one Dad drafted when he started the firm, the same one everyone in this room signed." My father set down his Scotch glass. His hand was steady, but he set it down with slightly too much precision, the way people do when they're working very hard to appear calm. He turned to me with a specific expression I recognized. It was the expression he used when he was about to reframe the situation as my fault. He said I was being vindictive. He said I was letting personal feelings interfere with a business decision. He said that if I had concerns about my role, I should have raised them through proper channels instead of blindsiding the board. I said I had raised them. 6 months ago, in his office, he had told me I was being paranoid. He said that was a private conversation. I said I had notes. Theo stood up. His chair caught the carpet and made a sound that was louder than it should have been. He said this was insane, that I was trying to sabotage him, that I had always resented his relationship with their father, and this was just the latest version of the same pattern. I want to tell you something about that moment. There's a version of this story where I felt triumphant right then, where I stood there with my evidence and my equity stake in my 12-page document and felt the satisfaction of watching the people who had dismissed me finally see the shape of what I'd built. And I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a fraction of that. A very small fraction, but mostly what I felt was tired. The specific, bone-deep tiredness of someone who has been making herself smaller for other people for so long that even winning feels like it's happening at a slight remove, like watching it through glass. My brother wasn't wrong that I had resented things. What he was wrong about was why. I didn't resent his relationship with our father. I grieved mine. I looked at Theo and I thought about the summer I was 17 when he broke his arm at a soccer tournament and my father drove 4 hours to sit with him in the ER, and I had a regional science competition the same weekend and no one came. I thought about my college graduation, which my father attended for 40 minutes before leaving for a client dinner. I thought about every performance review I had ever given myself, every stretch goal I had set and hit, every deal I had closed while my father was telling me I was doing well, honey. Really well, and then turning around and giving my brother an expanded mandate with none of the prerequisites. I had not built 23.4% of this firm to punish my brother. I had built it to make sure that what happened today could not happen without my knowing about it. And more than that, I had built it so that if it did happen, I would have something to say about it that couldn't be ignored. Douglas Calloway spoke for the first time since Martin had put down the document. He had a careful voice, the voice of a man who had been in deals long enough to know when a deal had changed shape. He asked me directly what I wanted. It was the right question. It was the first right question anyone in that room had asked. I said I wanted what I had earned. I wanted my role recognized formally, with title and compensation commensurate with my equity position and my contribution to the firm's growth. I wanted a co-leadership structure, not because I needed the title, but because the work deserved the acknowledgement. And I wanted it in writing, ratified by the board, before any change of control transaction moved forward. Martin said he would need to consult with outside counsel before advising the board on next steps. Douglas looked at my father. My father looked at me with an expression I didn't entirely have a name for. It wasn't anger anymore. It was something older and quieter and harder to sit with. He said he needed a moment. I said, "Take your time." He stepped out. Theo followed him. Through the glass wall of the conference room, I could see them in the hallway. My father talking with his hands the way he only did when he was genuinely unsettled. Theo listening with his arms crossed. The reception guests on the other side of the floor were still circulating, still holding their glasses, still largely unaware that the announcement they had just applauded had a structural problem. I sat down. I drank my water, the one I'd been holding since the beginning. Martin stayed in the room with me. He was a careful man, Martin. He had worked with my father for 15 years, and I had always respected him because he never condescended to me even when everyone else in the room was doing it casually, the way you breathe. He looked at the document on the table, and then he looked at me. He said the share acquisition was clean. I said I know. He said I had been patient. I said I had been patient. He almost smiled. He said he would get outside counsel on the phone. My father came back in 40 minutes later, without Theo, without Douglas. Just him, and the look on his face was one I had never seen before in 31 years. And it took me a moment to identify it because it was so unfamiliar. It was the look of a man who has run out of frames, who has tried every version of the story and found that none of them work anymore and is left standing in the actual situation without a narrative to protect him. He sat down across from me. He didn't reach for his drink. He said he didn't know I had done this. I said I know. He said he should have known. He should have been watching. I said yes. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the Chicago skyline was doing what it always did, which was exist without caring about any of us. The light was going orange over the lake. He said he didn't know how to do this differently. He said he had made decisions based on what he understood about the business, and he had not understood. He was trying to tell me he had not understood what I was actually doing here, what I had actually built. It was the closest thing to an apology I had ever heard from him. It wasn't a real one. Real ones don't come with that much passive construction. But it was something. And I had learned a long time ago not to hold out for the version of things that people aren't capable of giving. I said I wasn't asking him to restructure our relationship tonight. I was asking him to restructure the firm's governance to reflect reality. He said he would talk to the board. He did. It took 6 weeks of negotiation, 2 outside mediators, and 1 very tense call with Douglas Calloway, who turned out to be a pragmatic man when he understood the situation clearly. The committed capital stayed. The co-leadership structure was approved. My title was formally changed to co-managing director, and my equity position was acknowledged in the firm's updated operating agreement. Theo didn't speak to me for 2 months. When he did, it was at our aunt's birthday dinner, and it was brief and stiff and careful, the way you talk to someone you've recategorized in your head. I understood. I didn't push. Some bridges you can repair, and some bridges you let settle into whatever shape they've become, and you learn to cross them carefully. My father and I now have a standing Wednesday lunch. It's not warm. It's not the relationship I would have wanted if I had been asked to design one from scratch. But he asks real questions now, and he listens to the answers, and he stopped calling Theo first when there's a strategy decision to be made. It's not forgiveness exactly. It's something that functions like it when you look at it in the right light. There's something no one tells you about taking up the space you were always owed. They tell you it will feel like victory. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it feels like cleaning up after a flood, necessary, exhausting, and full of waterlogged things that will never quite go back to their original shape. But the floor is yours, and you don't have to apologize for standing on it. I drove home that Wednesday evening in October with the windows down, Lakeshore Drive doing what it does in fall, which is to be aggressively, unreasonably beautiful, like it's trying to make a point. I thought about my mother. I thought about the office in Wicker Park she had funded and never seen. I thought about the version of me that had gone home from my father's office 6 months ago and spent the weekend pretending she was fine. She wasn't fine, but she was building. And finally, at 31, on the 42nd floor of a building with my family's name on the lease, I had stopped asking for a seat at the table and started reading the fine print on who actually owned it.